how's things? Did you enjoy that week, that unbelievable week that we had?
Wonderful weather, yeah. Hi, John. Good to see you too. And I certainly did. Perfect weather for exploring, getting out and about. And it didn't last too long, so it won't have stressed. Certainly up in this part of the country, it won't have stressed our nature, our wildlife too much. But it was a glorious few days.
Now, if you've got a question that you'd like me to put to Aengus, feel free to get in touch. 086 60 20 5000 is the number. And the first question is, I often see large wasp-type insects with long tails. Well, there was plenty of wasps around the last week for sure. But these are wasp-type insects with long tails. Just wondering, what are they, and do they sting like a wasp?
Yeah, and there's a few different characters these guys could be, but we have a species or a few different species called wood wasps. And wood wasps, they're related to our wasps that do sting us, but these guys don't at all. And the way to tell them, first off, is they're very big. So if you see what looks like a giant wasp, as we're all familiar with the normal bright yellow and black wasps, but if you see something that's much bigger, don't panic, because it can't sting you, it cannot hurt you, it won't hurt you in any way. But the females have a long little tube at the back, which is, they're called their ovipositor. It's for laying eggs, but it looks like a big stinger. It looks like a big pin coming out the abdomen, the back of it. And it's not. It's for going into pine in particular. There's one, and the greater wood wasp is a very big thing. You can get as long as your little finger, and they will lay their eggs into pine. And their eggs, then those little larvae will live for 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years in pine wood, chewing, eating up the wood until eventually they emerge. And usually it's this time of year, late July, early August. They like a bit of heat, and out they come to breed.
But they're different to a hornet. They're no way.
Yeah, and we don't have hornets in Ireland, thank goodness. There was one record of an Asian hornet last year down in the southeast, but they seem to have caught it and eradicated it. We've no records of hornets really in Ireland, and none in Donegal certainly. Hornets hunt bees, so they're like big wasps as well. They hunt bees, so they're unpleasant for people perhaps, but they're more threatening to our bee species really. And they're not native to here, so there'd be something that wouldn't the bees mightn't be able to cope with so well. But we don't have them here. There's no records of them here whatsoever. So if you do see a giant wasp-like character, it's one of those wood wasps. And it's lived. That character's already lived for possibly 4, maybe even 5 years. It's quite amazing, really, until it's emerged and you get to see it.
That long, so it's a totally different lifespan to a wasp.
Yeah, and they can sometimes emerge in people's houses, actually, because they like pine wood, in particular, softwoods. And those softwoods are used so much for our skirting boards and our architraves and all that kind of thing, even our kitchens. That sometimes they might be quite happily, if they survive the lumber yard, might be quite happily living inside the cabinet of your kitchen. You don't know anything about it. And then eventually they emerge, this giant insect starts flying around the place with this long, sticky, outy looking stinger type thing, and people get quite alarmed. I've been sent a couple of pictures already this year of people wondering what they were, but they won't hurt you. They can't hurt you. Open the window, let them scoot out, and go on about their business.
All right, another question. I saw a butterfly at the weekend that had what looked like eyes on its wings. What are they?
They are one of our most common butterflies, for Donegal at least. They're called the peacock butterfly. And they're very dark when they close their wings. One of the ways to tell butterflies and moths, we have about 33, I think it is, species of butterfly in Ireland, whereas we've over 1,400 species of moths, so it's easier to get to know the butterflies. And in general, they're more colourful. Not always, some very colourful moths too. But the moths, when they close their wings tend to close flash down, or sometimes in a bit of a hump, but the wings tend to be down. Whereas the butterflies, when they close their wings, they're either partially closed or fully closed. And when they're closed like that, the underside of those wings is camouflaged. So the peacock, when it lands, it can tend to disappear. It's very, very dark, not quite black, but different shades of very dark brown on the underside. But then when it opens those wings, and it's quite a big butterfly, when it opens the wings, it's amazing because it's got that lovely red, rich red color, and then these 4 eyes on it, which of course are to scare off any predators. If a blackbird comes down to have a little poke and those wings open up, it sees those giant eyes, that they fly off, you know.
So that's nature's way of protecting the butterfly, with the eyes that are scary and then the underneath that's a camouflage.
Yeah, that's exactly it, yeah. And if you're watching, it's a lovely thing to do. And wait for a day when it's kind of 14, 15 degrees. That's all they need to fly. But they do like warm days. They won't be flying on wet days, damp days, or cold days. But we're still going to get a few more warm days. not as warm as last week, but go out and look for the butterflies. And if you find one, try and follow it and see when it lands. And as they close their wings, they nearly disappear. They're quite amazing. And those peacocks that you'll see now, they're very fresh. And what I mean by that is they've just emerged. They have been spending the last few weeks as very hungry caterpillars munching away on nettles. Nettles is their food source. If there was no nettles, there'd be no peacock butterflies. And they eat away for a few weeks until they eventually get big enough, form their cocoon, and metamorphosize into the adult butterfly. And that adult butterfly, that peacock that your listener saw, will overwinter. It will go into a shed. It'll go into a log pile. It'll even go into somebody's house, maybe into an attic space, somewhere where the temperature is kind of stable. And it'll sit there for the winter. And if it's outside, it could freeze solid, pretty much. 3 or 4 times throughout the winters. It's quite amazing, really. They have a little bit of antifreeze in their body, in their own systems, which
still survive. They'll still survive,
and they'll still survive.
Frozen a number of times.
Even in those really cold winters, they'll still survive. Yeah, it's quite amazing. And then eventually out they'll emerge. I've seen them as early as March, right up north in a showing. But April time is when they start coming out, and they're looking for the nettles. Of course, they come out too early. There'll be no nettles, and they will lay their eggs onto the nettles. Those caterpillars then will turn into the end of next summer's peacock butterflies, and around the cycle goes.
Okay, the hungry caterpillar. The peacock butterfly, anyhow, very distinctive with those eyes on its wings. And is it true that many buzzards die young? Asked somebody. I don't see that many about anymore.
The pressures on birds of prey in particular, anything that's the top of the food chain, has a very, very difficult time for sure. So it's got to make sure that there's enough food source for it, but also it needs to get its own territory. So at this time of year, you'll hear, or you might be lucky enough to hear young buzzards, because the mum and dad have effectively let them go. And they're now in the same area. They haven't been chased from the territory of where they bred or where they grew up. But they'll be flying around calling, and that's their begging call. Basically, they're calling for food. And in the next few weeks, as autumn starts to set in, mum and dad will chase them off, will push them off, and they'll go off and try and find their own territory then. And that's when they're particularly vulnerable. Bad weather is coming, trying to find their own territory, being pushed on by other rival birds. But if they can establish an area, and as long as we are looking after the area well enough, we're not setting poison out into animals and that kind of thing, because, of course, they're scavengers. They clean up a lot of our roadkill. Well, as long as the poison isn't there and there's some trees for their shelter, they'll have a reasonable chance. But the next few weeks is definitely the trickiest time for them.
Okay. So they would scavenge. They would pick up roadkill, and I suppose it's a handy meal for them.
Yeah, they're amazing birds, really. They'll hunt pigeons, they'll hunt crows, which some people don't like and some people see as pests or a nuisance. They'll hunt rabbits and rats and mice, but they'll also take frogs, they'll take worms. You'll sometimes see them sitting in the middle of a field, maybe on top of a fence post or a limb of a tree, and they're watching, and they'll suddenly dive down onto the ground. And even if you've had a good view, you'd be thinking, I can't see what it went for. But they're looking for any worms, and any damp weather, the worms will be scurrying across the surface of the soil, and they'll take those too. But absolutely, they'll take roadkill, of which there's plenty, unfortunately. And this time of year, there's quite often a lot, as young animals are on the move. Young badgers are out exploring. Young hares are out trying to figure out their area. And often they fall victim to our roads. But the birds clean that up for us.
I was watching a documentary on TV yesterday where up in Yellowstone during the harsh winter, the owls are able to spot shrews, I think it is, just going in under the snow, and if they see any movement at all, they're straight in. So it's the same with buzzards and worms.
Same, their eyesight is about 8 times better than us. So if you've ever used a pair of binoculars, most binoculars are either 8 or 10 times more powerful. So if you've looked through a decent set of binoculars, that's what they're able to see. That's what they have the ability to be able to see all the time. And they're able to see that detail when they focus on something a little bit further away. So any small little movement at all, even at quite a distance, they can spot reasonably well. But how different birds hunt like that is quite amazing. Something I saw just the other day up on Knockalla, actually, at the end of Port Salin, on the cliffs there. And it was a windy evening, and there was a kestrel, which is sometimes called the wind hover. and because they hover. So they're one of the only birds of prey that will hover for prolonged periods. And they hover, and then they might fly another 100 yards, and then they'll stop and they'll hover again. But they're watching out for little mice, little rodents. But they can see in a UV light that we can't see, in the UV spectrum that we can't see. And little rodents like mice are constantly urinating and constantly leaving a little trail of urine behind them. And that glows out. It emits a bit of a UV light. And the kestrels are able to see that, and they're able to follow those trails and then find the mouse. Even if the mouse is buried under heather or whatever it is, they're able to that's the giveaway for them. It's quite incredible.
What chance does a bird mouse have?
Yeah, very little. Well, but then they breed incredibly fast, so they do okay that way.
I feel too sorry for them now. And buzzards, are they? I mean, this texture says that they aren't seeing as many of them as they used to. Are they under threat? Are they? Would buzzards be our most common birds of prey?
At this stage, there or thereabouts. The sparrowhawk is probably more common. And it's funny, the kestrel that I just mentioned there is now in big trouble. The kestrel is on the orange list of birds, of threatened birds. Unfortunately, their numbers have been going down and down. And a lot of that is as we, over the last few years, have tidied up the kind of habitats they need. So they need their hunting, their foraging habitats with all those little rodents in them. And as we spray stuff and clear areas, of course, we're clearing out their food, which is tragic. So that often pushes them, along with the likes of barn owls, hunt for similar kind of prey, and that pushes them towards the motorways and the roadways and the big verges there. And it's great to have those verges. However, the trucks going flying past, we've all experienced being a bit too close to a bus or a truck or a big vehicle going by, and there's a big suck of air afterwards, and that can really knock them off their flight, and that's a big threat to them. The sparrowhawks are doing better, and the buzzards were nearly wiped out altogether. And round about the 1950s, they were nearly completely gone. There was still a couple of strongholds in the north, and they've started to spread themselves. And one of the great things about the buzzards, in particular in the last 20 years, they've come back. So your listener might have been gone from that area, locally gone, but in general, their numbers are doing well, and they're spreading throughout the country. And it just shows if we leave areas alone, if we leave habitats alone, and if we stop spreading poison, for instance, that was one of the big changes that came about with the Golden Eagle reintroduction program. The laws around laying poison changed, and landowners, to be fair to them, were very good, and virtually all were respectful of that, and that's made a big difference. And that's one of the things that's allowed those buzzards to come back. And then remember, they're also doing that tidying up service for us. So even if they're lost locally in one place, nationally they're doing reasonably okay.
So we're coming into a time now where we should be seeing quite a few young buzzards who've been hoofed out of the nest, and they're off looking for their own territory, because they're quite territorial buzzards.
They are very territorial. And what I'll do is I'll play the sound, because buzzards are unusual in that they call, they're very vocal. So the parents will call a lot to each other in the springtime. If other birds come in the winter time, they will call to each other and call to them to try and chase them off. And then the youngsters make quite a racket at this time of year. Let me see if you can hear this now. People might recognize that sound. So quite loud, whereas, of course, most birds of prey, they don't make, or they make very little sound. The young ones make noise, all right, when they're doing their begging calls, but after that, there's very little sound, because, of course, they don't want to give themselves away. Whereas the buzzards are quite happy to be vocal. Now, when they're hunting, they'll stop that, of course. But a lot of the time, when they're cruising, exploring their territory, or trying to gently coax the youngster and say, you've had your time, it's time to move on.
Right. And someone says, once we get a spell of hot weather here, out come the flying ants. Why is this, and what purpose do they serve? There was a couple of days during the week when they were a real menace. I just, no matter what road you went on, they seemed to be out in force, and they're attracted to white for some reason. So what purpose do they serve?
Yeah, the ants are, well, we have a couple of species. We have the black ant and the red ant, but the black ant is by far the most common. And they serve a multitude of purposes. They have their role, right? All of those ants that are appearing now, the winged ants, that's the males and the new queens that are heading off to breed. And they can do that at any stage in the summertime, really, but they tend to like the hotter weather so it tends to peak around about July, early August, if we get a good little warm spell. I had a large number of them come out in my own garden, actually, about a week ago. The same kind of thing. Suddenly, all these little characters were only there for about 2 or 3 hours, and they were crawling up little bits of vegetation. And one area of the lawn, about a square meter of the lawn, was covered in these ants, which could look alarming if you weren't sure about them. But they won't do us any harm. You just leave them alone, and within 2 to 3 hours, they're all gone. All gone. Most of them, of course, will be eaten by birds. Some will be eaten by spiders. Some by dragonflies. Some by other characters as well. So they're very important as part of the food chain. The ones that are lucky enough to breed, well, then the males will die. The females, then they're able to remove their own wings, and then they bury themselves down into mud, and they create a little cell, a little chamber in the mud where they'll overwinter, and then they'll form next year's colony of ants.
Ants that stay on the ground are bad enough, but ones that can fly, they're super annoying.
Well, I'd say if you're scooting along on your bike now at high speed and the mouth is open trying to suck in. You're getting free protein there, right? That'll be a bit frustrating, right. But they're short-lived, and sometimes you'll see in some of the newspapers that there's a plague of ants coming and this kind of thing. We don't get plagues of ants coming. They come in a batch. They don't live for very long, and they're a very welcome boost. You've got to remember this time of year, there's more birds than any other time as well, even though they've gone quiet. But if you've had an opportunity to sit in the garden in this warm weather in the evening times and just stay still, turn off the radio, take the earphones out and just sit. For the first few minutes, you'll think, what am I doing? There's nothing happening. There's no nature here. And if you've any hedgerows around you, any bushes around you, you'll start hearing tick, tick, tick of little birds communicating to each other. And then you'll start to see them getting braver and braver. And they're relying on the likes.
But you see, would need to be sitting beside you, because most of us wouldn't have a clue what birds are what birds are making the noise, or what they're trying to say. You'd be able to decipher it all, work it all out.
Well, you can hear the robins. Actually, so if you do hear a song at this time of year, normally it's really only the robins or the wrens. They're the two that will sing all year round. And the young ones, you can hear them starting to sing. So most people are probably familiar with those sounds of the robins, but it's well worth listening to, because the for the next few weeks, the songs are kind of a bit weak, but sometimes a bit all over the place. And the new robins and new wrens are starting to learn the songs off the adults. And they're literally listening and then trying to impersonate. And sometimes they end up putting their own little flair on it until it kind of settles a little bit. So you'll hear all sorts of strange variants of the robin and the wren song. And they're about the only ones you hear right now.
And finally, someone says that they noticed tiny silvery green colored insects dotted all along a stretch of the road. Any idea what they are?
There's there's a few things that could be, but if they're very small, they're very common, or if there's an awful lot of them, there's a good chance that the dock beetle, the green dock beetle. And if you think of the dock leaf, if you get stung by a nettle, people will often pick the dock leaf and rub it on the sting. So these little characters, they lay their eggs, huge numbers of eggs, onto the back of the dock leaves, and then the little babies will eat down the docks for you. So they'll take care of those. People don't seem to like docks in their garden, even though they provide sustenance for these lovely little bugs, which again feed birds and other characters. Mm-hmm. Plus, of course, the docks have lots of seeds that goldfinches and chaffinches and whatnot will come into your garden, and they'll eat those seeds a bit later in the year. But those little tiny silvery green iridescent beetles, there's a good chance that's what they are. The females are a bit bigger, and you'd recognize them. I think they're about 6-7 mils long, and they've got a kind of blackish bit when they're about to lay eggs on their abdomen, which is the back of the beetle. But beautiful, really shiny, and they're a lovely one to introduce children to if you're trying to get children to explore nature a little bit. As you'll find them, they're very docile, they can't hurt you in any way, and they're beautiful with that color.
I have seen them, and they're tiny. They really are very small. So they're small beetles. Okay, Aengus, Nature Northwest, and on Facebook, and also at the website if anybody's looking for more information. Thank you, Aengus. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Thanks. And if I could just mention, there's Heritage Week on at the moment. I have a couple of walks on. They're booked, but there's lots of other walks. There's over 60 events. Donegal has put on a huge amount of events, in fairness to Joe Gallagher and everybody there in the Heritage Council, in the Heritage Office. And all these events, or pretty much all of them, are free. So look up Heritage Council or Heritage Week Donegal, and you'll find lots of great stuff. Right. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Aengus.
Clearly and loudly. Is listening to the TV
Perfect.
or radio
Thanks, Neil.
becoming harder?